Hello, everyone. This is Nairi from Low Carbon Fasting. Our guest today is the author of the book Ravenous. Now, the full title of the book is Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. Welcome to Low Carbon Fasting, Sam Apple.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
How would you like me to refer to you? Mr. Apple, Sam?
Yes, Sam, it's great.
Sam is great. Okay, so the book was first published in 2021. So, and I'm lucky I actually purchased the Kindle version and just finished reading it. In fact, I finished it just yesterday, the last 3 chapters. So, Sam Apple, you call yourself a journalist, but you have a background in writing, but you have a background in science as well. So you're the perfect candidate to have written a book that includes not only biography. Well, it is a biographical book of Otto Warburg, the great scientist, Nobel Prize winning scientist, but it also combines history, science, and almost reads almost like fiction. It's a grouping. You wouldn't want to put the book down, in fact. So what is your professional background for those of, those people in the audience who may not have heard of you?
Sure. I'm a writer by training. I studied English literature and creative writing as an undergraduate student. And I did take some science courses, but that was not my focus. And then I did a master's degree in writing, an MFA in writing after college. And since, after that, I worked for many years as a journalist writing about different topics. I did not think of myself as a science journalist, but one of my books is called American Parent. And I was writing about my experience, raising my newborn son. And I became very curious about all the different parenting practices and whether or not they were actually valid scientifically and where they came from. And so I think that was the start of my science journalism career in a way. But at the time, I hadn't been particularly interested in nutrition. But I became, I reached my 30s and was not in great shape. And I became curious about what was going on. And I began reading more. I came across the works of Gary Taubes, and that got me very interested in nutrition. And I just started, started reading more and learning more, and sort of gradually became a science journalist. And now I teach in the science writing program at Johns Hopkins University.
Yes, you're a faculty member there. Yeah, you mentioned that on your social media platforms. So what inspired you to write this particular book about Otto Warburg? Well, how did it come about?
Sure. It was, really an interest in metabolism that started things off, and interested in low carb nutrition. Like many people, probably many people in your audience, I grew up thinking dietary fat was the worst thing in the world, and ate, only low fat and skim milk. And so I was very surprised to see that the scientific underpinnings of that science, were much weaker than I would have ever dreamed. And, given how significant that is, it was really a shock to me. But I didn't want to, Gary Taubes and Teicholz and many others have written interesting books on this. I didn't want to do something that somebody else had already done. And I was fascinated by the cancer connection in particular, because other diseases, sort of intuitively, it made sense to me that they were connected to metabolism, but I had really truly believed that cancer was a separate realm. I guess I knew that obesity had been linked to cancer, but I had never really stopped and thought that through. So I just thought cancer is, an unlucky mutation, or, sun exposure or smoking, but it never occurred to me that, every bite of food you eat, in theory, could be a part of this story as well. So that was really a shock to me. And then I wanted to think about, how do I tell this story? How do I dig into it? And I came across Otto Warburg, and, as a journalist, as a storyteller, I'm always in search of a good character, and he's a great character, not necessarily a great person, but a great character.
He certainly is a great character. And so the title, talking about the title, Ravenous, obviously meaning sort of constantly hungry, insatiable. And you're talking about the cancer cells
Yeah, well,
having this insatiable hunger for particularly glucose. But what, I mean, you'll comment on that in a minute, but what I also love is that Otto Warburg's character is also ravenous for recognition, for status, for power.
yeah.
Would you comment on that,
Yeah,
please?
I'm glad you picked up on that. I don't know how many people did, but I really thought it was a title that worked on many different levels. It speaks, first and foremost to the cancer cells, as you mentioned. You can think of it in terms of, Warburg being ravenous for fame and power, and then of course the Nazis were ravenous in their own way. So it works on different levels. Although I admit that it actually wasn't my first choice for a title. I wanted to call it a disease of civilization, because I thought that could also work at multiple levels. Cancer was called a disease of civilization, although that's now kind of a racist, outdated term. Now you would say, a disease of modern industrialized world. But, I thought you could also talk about Nazism as a disease of civilization and ideological disease. I thought that worked on both levels as well, but my publisher said that title was too heavy. So I gave up on that battle.
Well, perhaps for the better, because
Yeah, I'm sure they were right.
Equally, diabetes is also called, type 2 diabetes called disease of civilization. I also heard recently of different forms of dementia being called disease of civilization. Yeah. So that would have been a very sort of much more broad.
Yeah, no, the publisher has learned not to listen to me. They're probably smart about that.
Okay, so what was Otto Warburg's? We'll talk about his upbringing, etc. But before we do that, what was his original hypothesis? Very early on, he realized that cancer cells had a different metabolism. So would you comment on that, all the scientific sort of information?
Yeah, that was really, the key discovery, which he made, all the way back in 1923, which was that, cancer cells took up nutrients in a dramatically different way from other cells, from healthy cells. They were taking up much more glucose than other cells that were not growing in this way. And rather than burning the glucose with oxygen in the mitochondria, these so-called power stations of our cell, they were instead fermenting it, taking the glucose up very rapidly, and sort of a quick way of processing nutrients. You just split the glucose in two and, attach some hydrogen, send it out of the cell in the form of lactic acid. And, the fermentation process is identical, to what the microorganisms do. Some produce alcohol, some produce lactic acid, but, it was really a striking finding that cancer cells were behaving in this way. And one of Warburg's first comments was, what he really discovered is that the cancer cell behaves much like a yeast.
So he presented his first paper in 1923, and so you mentioned 1923. So and that was he first published and presented it, I think, in the United States, and that probably gave him recognition, and also secured a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yeah. So he made, one of the incredible things about him is that, he made discoveries in many different areas. And in fact, his Nobel Prize, which he won in 1931, wasn't even for his cancer research. He should have won it for his cancer research, but instead they gave it to somebody else who made a discovery that turned out to be entirely wrong. But then maybe they felt bad about that, and they recognized Warburg in 1931 for his discovery of the final stage of respiration, the final stage of how a cell uses oxygen to generate, ATP and energy. He did present those findings in the United States in 1929, I believe it was, and the Rockefeller Foundation was so impressed that they, gave him money to build an institute in Germany. And one of the striking things about that is it's not that long after World War I, and you have an American institute, volunteering to, help rebuild German science. So, it's pretty incredible that happened.
Yes, 1921. It was 1921. But Germany was even before the 1900s, in the late 1800s, Germany was one of the world's leading sort of science bases. There were world leaders in scientific research, and you would have found many sort of leading scientists residing in Germany. Now, Otto Warburg's father himself was a scientist. So how did that influence? How did his upbringing and the home environment shape him as a scientist?
Yeah, no, that was a huge part of his background. His father was a very prominent physicist, had a chair in physics at the University of Berlin, which, was very unusual for somebody of Jewish heritage to attain that level of success. And he was very close with Einstein and Max Planck and other titans of German science, and they absolutely were dominant in science. All of the famous names, and Fritz Haber were regular people in Warburg's childhood home. And so I believe he truly grew up just assuming that he was going to make great scientific discoveries. And the only question in his mind was, what would be the world-changing discovery that I make? And he decided on cancer, not necessarily because he had a personal connection, but because it was one of the few areas where the Germans were making no progress. They were making tremendous progress in physics and in medicine against bacterial diseases. Robert Koch had changed the world by identifying the microorganisms that were responsible, for all these diseases. But cancer, meanwhile, was growing more and more common, and it was, it's creating something of a panic in the German world.
You do give some interesting statistics from around the world at that time in the late 1800s, how fast cancer was growing as a disease.
Yeah. And
you mentioned the San Francisco study.
Yeah.
It was probably one of the largest studies at the time. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the study you're referring to, I think that was one of the Frederick Hoffman studies. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
It's interesting that this American insurance statistician, Frederick Hoffman, actually became the world's authority on cancer statistics and the statistics of many other diseases. And it became apparent to these people because if you work in insurance, you keep track of what people are dying from. You start seeing, more and more people dying of cancer, and it becomes this big debate. Why is this happening? Is it possibly that people are living longer lives? Is it possible that we find a new way of diagnosing this? So it's controversial, but many people have looked into it, and it seems, to me at least, indisputable that cancer actually was becoming more and more common at the time, and then throughout the 20th century. And so these studies, they started doing surveys of, including the San Francisco study that you're talking about, just collecting cancer statistics and trying to conduct surveys about, how people lived prior to getting cancer, and to see if they could, make any inferences about, what caused the disease. And Frederick Hoffman, who looked into this more than anybody who's ever lived, probably became absolutely convinced that it was diet that was the main determinant.
It was fascinating for me because, as early as the, early 1900s, they established that there must have been a connection between diet and cancer, because they couldn't find it in indigenous populations. Cancer was almost non-existent in indigenous populations. So they did call it disease of civilization.
Yeah. No, I mean, in fairness, I mean, you make a good point, but in fairness, the fact that it clearly arose, I think it's indisputable that you had these indigenous populations where there was no cancer, and then in the industrial world, you see the cancer. So clearly something about that transition, is responsible. But it doesn't mean it's diet, but I believe the best evidence, there are other things that change as well, but I think the diet is the most obvious one.
Yeah, I think starting from the 1920s, they were also looking at connection between environmental factors, other than diet, and their connection to cancer. For example, they were looking at toxins, carcinogens, or even fertilizers used to fertilize soil, etc. So, when we talk of these things today, we almost take them in as if it's new science and new discovery and something, oh, absolutely outrageous. But they were talking about these things 120 years ago. And yet we haven't made that much of a progress, or have we, in in finding a treatment or even a prevention for cancer?
Yeah, no, we've made shockingly little progress in some respects. I mean, we've done a very good job in terms of keeping people alive longer with certain types of cancers, and chemotherapy, beginning in the 1950s was, extremely important innovation. But with respect to, the last 50 years, there's been much less progress than people realize, I think. And, that's not to take away from the extremely valuable research that's been done, or, the great, it's incredible how many people that we can now say that we couldn't. But when you look at prevention and cancer incidence, it's incredibly frustrating to see that we're not making progress in that area. And that's despite the fact that we've made a lot of gains with respect to smoking. And it's my belief that, it's always two steps forward and then, not one step back, but two steps back, because, we're not making any progress on the diet part of it.
Yeah, another thing that they came up with, almost 100 years ago, was pesticides used in growing produce. And they could link it, or they suspected it had a close link to cancer. And yet we've made absolutely no progress in that area either. But you're right, you mentioned smoking. That's perhaps one area we've sort of almost, not globally perhaps, but at least in Western countries, we've almost won the battle.
Yeah, no, smoking is a definite success story. And it, gives me hope that if we can just, convince the world that, certain foods, excess sugar in particular, can be thought of in the way cigarettes can be thought of as a cancer risk, then I think we could make progress. But it's very hard to get that message to sink in.
So Otto Warburg's hypothesis, I would call it, that cancer cells ferment more, but there shouldn't be that much fermentation going on within a cancer cell if there is oxygen present. Have I understood this correctly?
Right. Yeah. That's exactly
so that
right.
was the puzzle, and he went on for decades trying to understand why cancer cells are actually involved in more fermentation, or they are fermenting more when actually oxygen is present. Yeah. So what part of his hypothesis was he able to prove at the end, and what part was actually proven wrong?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. What's known today as the Warburg effect is when a cell ferments, even though oxygen is available. You would expect this shift to fermentation to occur if oxygen, can't be used or is unavailable. I refer to it as a backup engine. And the best example of this is, during strenuous exercise, if your cells can't keep up with demand by the normal energy processes, they'll start to ferment some of that glucose to make up for the energy demand. So it's supposed to be like an emergency thing, but Warburg saw cancer cells were doing it even though oxygen was available. So he thought that is the key to cancer in his mind, is this shift to fermentation. And he tried to figure out over the course of his life why it was happening, because he thought if he could figure that out, that would explain what cancer is, why cancer is caused. And I believe that he was correct in identifying this shift in metabolism, this metabolic alteration, as the key component of cancer, as sort of the starting point. But I don't necessarily believe he was correct in explaining why it happens. His hypothesis was that a cell would never do this unless there's some sort of damage to the mitochondria, to the power station, because why would you turn on a less efficient way of making energy if you have a more efficient way? So his hypothesis was that something mechanically is wrong that causes the shift. And I think, maybe we'll go into this more, but I sort of come down on the side of people who are scientists who have suggested that it's less about the structural damage in the cell and more about the advantages that excess glucose gives the cell in terms of an ability to rapidly make daughter cells. There's a lot of nuances to this debate because it is true that as cancers develop, they actually do struggle to get oxygen, and then they actually do function much like Warburg described. But I think the key question is what's happening at the earliest stages. That's what we want to figure out.
Yeah, and I don't think he was able to figure it out until I don't think he lived long enough to find out.
Yeah, but I should say there are some scientists working today who continue to believe that Warburg had it exactly right. But I sided with the majority, I would say, is saying that he got part of it wrong.
Yeah, Warburg effect, otherwise known as aerobic glycolysis for the scientists in our audience. So we're still getting credit for that, and that's a well-known fact. Yeah. So he did leave a large legacy behind.
Yeah, no, I mean, it should be said that regardless of the explanation, what he found is true, that 70% or more of all cancers do this shift to fermentation, and that's a hugely important discovery. And he, apart from cancer, made extremely important discoveries in photosynthesis and respiration. He crystallized, just an astonishing number of different enzymes. I mean, he really changed the world of biochemistry in the 1920s and 30s in a remarkable way.
I'd like us to talk about, Otto Warburg's character. Now, in the historical background, the context when, he was a young scientist, we're looking at Germany in the early 1900s. He was of Jewish descent. He was a Jewish man, and he was also homosexual. So that would have put him, that would have made him vulnerable for persecution, and yet he somehow escaped. He escaped the Holocaust. He escaped persecution at every other level. He even enlisted in the army, and we're talking about World War I here. So when he was very young, he was enlisted in German army. So can you talk more about that? Was it sheer luck that he escaped persecution at all levels? Or was it his courage, or perhaps even arrogance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a little bit of all of those things. His father came from a Jewish family. His mother was not Jewish, but the name Warburg is a very famous Jewish name, particularly in Germany. Many of his cousins were among the most famous Jewish people in the country. He didn't really practice Judaism in any way. And his father actually, like many German Jews, eventually converted to become a Protestant just so he could rise in the university. So Warburg did not have a strong Jewish identity, but everybody knew the name Warburg was Jewish. And on top of that, as you mentioned, he had a male partner. He wasn't openly gay. Nobody really was, but they lived together. It was pretty obvious. So when the Nazis came along, he was really, in a uniquely dangerous situation because of these two factors. But he did have some other things that worked in his favor. One, he had served in World War I in 1933. That still made a difference that you had been a veteran of the war, as many Jews were. But, the other thing working in his favor at the beginning was that he had already won the Nobel Prize. He had money from the Rockefeller Foundation, so he was harder to touch than some of the others. And then, shockingly, when the Nazis harassed him in 33 and 34, he stood up to them. He chased Nazi inspectors out of his institute. He refused to do the Hitler salute when everybody else was doing it. And originally I thought, when I started to look into the story, I thought, wow, what an incredible, admirable person. I came to appreciate over the years of research that, what really drove him crazy about the Nazis was that they were telling him what to do. He was so arrogant that the thought that anybody bossing him around, telling him what to do was just too much for him to bear. So I think he didn't leave Germany when many of the other Jewish scientists in his position did, because, it would have looked bad that somebody had chased him away. He wasn't going to stand for that. And so, part of me still admires him for his bravery and the way he reacted to the Nazis. But I did see that, he was so arrogant that what was really driving him was his own interest rather than a sort of humanitarian drive.
It's interesting. He does mention in one of his letters to his sister, he says he cannot bear the refugee status. So if he leaves Germany, goes somewhere else, he will not be the renowned Otto Warburg scientist. He will have to start from scratch, and that refugee status would be too hard for him to bear.
The thing that captures Warburg best is that conversation a similar conversation where he said, another scientist can just go to another country, but it's very hard for a king to find a new kingdom. That's how he thought of himself. And it's very surprising, but in the early 30s, the Jews who fled from Germany were looked upon, it was thought to be a shameful thing, like they left in humiliation. Now we look back and think, those were the smartest people in the world. They got out of there. But at the time, it was looked at in a very different way. And Warburg could not do anything that seemed humiliating. He was too proud for that.
Also, I think he would have had to take his partner with him. So logistically, it would have been harder.
Yeah, and you had to leave your money behind. He had gained a lot of wealth. He didn't want to leave that behind either.
Do you think it was unusual at the time, you did make a reference to that, for the Rockefeller Foundation to have funded a brand new institute? I mean, that was quite costly, spectacular institute for Otto Warburg, which he ran pretty much independently in Germany, just following the First World War. And what was what were they trying to achieve in the Rockefeller Foundation, investing in this Jewish scientist residing in Germany?
I mean, it still surprises me that they did that. And they also gave, at the same time, a lot of money on Warburg's request. He requested not only his own institute, but money for a physics institute. So I think they really believed that the World War I era was over and that it was a new Germany. This is really about a decade after the end of the World War I. And, they didn't see the Nazi threat coming, and they thought it was time to invest in science. Germany, as you already mentioned, was the leading scientific country. So, if they were going to change, the Rockefellers wanted to cure cancer as much as anybody else. It looked like Warburg would be the person to do this. And it seemed like a good investment. I think they were very embarrassed afterwards. Warburg tried, after World War II, he tried to go back to the Rockefeller Foundation, and they sort of washed their hands of him because it was embarrassing that they had funded German science in retrospect. But the people that were making these decisions inside the Rockefeller Foundation were scientists themselves. They knew and admired Warburg, and they knew of his greatness, and they wanted to be a part of it, I think.
I think there was an expectation that if anyone was going to come up with a cure or a therapy, as you call it in the book, for cancer, it would probably be Warburg.
Yeah, I mean, he was certainly a leading candidate. He had made this world-changing discovery about the metabolism of cancer cells. He was telling, he was arrogant, so he was telling people that he was going to cure cancer, and there was reason to believe him given the incredible discoveries he had made.
Yeah, and I have to mention here that Germany was the world's first international Congress of Cancer Research was actually held in Germany at the time. So that's interesting, to mention. I was also fascinated by the general obsession of the German population with germs, or eliminating germs, with purification, with sort of clean living. As early as the 1900s, German authorities were advising women, for example, to check their breasts for cancer lumps. So no other country was doing that in my, that's as far as I know. Would you like to comment on that? This is this is pre-Nazi Germany, right?
Yeah. So the Germans, as we've already mentioned, were ahead of the rest of the world in many different sciences, including cancer science. So they were, made the first, like 20 years before the rest of the world, the Germans connected smoking to cancer and certain other chemicals to cancer. And, meanwhile, cancer rates were getting more and more, we're increasing and increasing. And many other diseases have been linked to microorganisms, tuberculosis and anthrax and on and on. And so, it seemed at the time possible that cancer was also going to be linked to a microorganism, so that they looked into that as well. But, the really interesting and kind of problematic and uncomfortable truth is that even during the Nazi era, the Germans made progress in cancer that other countries weren't making. And it was partly because the Nazis inherited an incredible scientific establishment. And perhaps also because, the Nazis, as part of their ideology, were obsessed with purity and cleanliness. And, this historian, Robert Proctor, who influenced my thinking about this, argued that in the Nazi mind, the Jews were just one more sort of contagion. They looked at it as one more impurity, and that the whole Nazi project could be thought of as sort of a hygienic experiment, is the term he used, to cleanse the body of all impurity. So it's horrific, but it is also true that they made some progress in cancer in terms of being extremely motivated to purify the body and learn about, what possible carcinogens could be in the environment.
And the obsession to find out the causes of cancer or to eliminate cancer, particularly cancer, was probably intensified with Hitler himself.
Yeah.
Having this great, living pretty much his whole life in fear of particularly cancer, because he lost his mother at a young age, cancer.
Yeah, I mean, so Hitler, like Warburg, grew up during this period where cancer was becoming more common and Germans were becoming afraid of it. And then, when Hitler was a young man, his mother died of breast cancer. His mother was the only person he was able to connect with, the only person he ever loved, historians say, and he was absolutely devastated. The doctor treating Hitler's mother was Jewish, and he later reported that he's never in his life seen anybody more upset than young Hitler watching his mother die of breast cancer. And Hitler was a hypochondriac, and he worried about many conditions, but he was always obsessed with cancer. And that was probably one of the most surprising parts of my research, just seeing the extent, how often Hitler talked about cancer and how much it was in his thoughts. And so, it's not surprising, the connection between Warburg surviving and the Nazis being obsessed with cancer is probably not a coincidence. You can't prove directly that Hitler said save him because he's going to cure cancer, but there's a tremendous amount of circumstantial evidence. And indeed, on the very day that Warburg was inside, Hitler's headquarters, hours later, we see that Hitler is talking about cancer research, and Hitler's top deputies were overseeing Warburg's case, and Hitler would be involved, in the process where somebody like Warburg was protected by this Aryanization process. Hitler was known to oversee these cases, and there's 10 other reasons, but it's very clear that the Nazis were obsessed with cancer, and I think it's very likely that Hitler was involved, although we don't know exactly how that played out.
It seemed like that when I was reading the book, because it was very unlikely that he would have. He had many enemies, even from within his own institute, it seems. So it was very unlikely that he would have, escaped. So there was this classification of full Jews and Jews and etc. And he didn't buy any of that. He just said he wasn't a Jew to anyone, any authority who was questioning his Jewish background. He either refused to provide paperwork, or he just said he wasn't a Jew.
It's a really important point, because it's something that I think many people don't understand. I certainly didn't understand it until I got into this research that one of the reasons Warburg had an advantage was that he was only half a Jew. It's commonly said that if you had even one Jewish grandparent, then you were a Jew by Nazi standards and you're all treated the same. And it is true that the Nazis planned to eliminate anybody who had one Jewish grandparent. But it's also true that during the 1930s, they did, beginning in 1935, they started to make distinctions, and half Jews were treated slightly better than quarter Jews. Quarter Jews were treated slightly better than half Jews, and half Jews were treated slightly better than full Jews. And, in the end, they decided that half Jews like Warburg would be treated like full Jews, and that quarter Jews would be more protected. So Warburg ended up on the wrong side of the divide. But I do think that being only half Jewish helped him survive a little bit longer than he might have otherwise.
His sister did leave Germany, though.
His sister fled wisely.
Now, I'd like to mention his cousin, Erich Warburg, who lived in the United States. Then he came to help, or he searched for Otto Warburg. Didn't he? And on a number of occasions, he helped him financially.
Yeah. So he was, Erich Warburg was part of the famous Jewish Warburg family that, they were bankers in Hamburg, and he left. But then after the war, the post-war West German government brought him back to help in the, rebuilding of Germany. And, one of his jobs was, to sort of secure German science, because both, the Americans and the Russians, the Soviets, were sort of poaching and taking away. And they certainly didn't want Otto Warburg to end up in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets were very interested in him. It's clear they gave him a Mercedes, among other things. So he went to Germany to find Warburg, and, I think helped make sure that he didn't end up in Soviet hands.
Interesting. Now, when he was enlisted in the First World War, enlisted in the army, his family were worried about him. They didn't like the idea of him serving in the army. They even got Einstein sending him a letter, I think, or trying to intervene to say, hey, we can't lose you as a scientist. The army is not the right place for you. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite Warburg stories. And the letter still exists. His parents wanted him to come back. He wasn't coming back. So, I mentioned that Einstein was a family friend. So they turned to Einstein and got him to reach out to Warburg. But what I love is that Einstein's letter was written so perfectly that he played into Warburg's vanity, which was exactly the right thing. He said, "You're too important to science." That is an argument that Warburg would hear. So Warburg did come back, and, the war was almost over at that point anyways, but it's possible that Einstein's letter saved his life.
But do you also think that the fact that he'd served in the German army in the First World War gave him some kind of a sense of security, that he would perhaps not be sort of, he would be treated differently?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. And, I think that it wasn't just Warburg. When 1933 came around, and suddenly, German Jews were, persona non grata, they were no longer welcome in Germany. It was particularly shocking because they had been extremely patriotic, signing up for the war, when they didn't have to. 2% of all German Jews died fighting in World War I. Some German Jews who had actually emigrated to Palestine came back to fight for Germany, and they wanted to prove that they were real Germans, and they were proud to be real Germans. And so when 1933 came along, they, was just flabbergasted that they could be treated this way. I mean, Fritz Haber, who, was one of the German heroes of World War I, was maybe a villain because he, did so much to push forward chemical weapons, but in the German minds, he was a war hero, and he just couldn't believe that, overnight he was, chased out of the country. He died heartbroken a year later. So, it was just an incredible thing for German Jews. They obviously were aware that there was anti-Semitism, but the suddenness of the shift was still incredible.